Alberta Primetime with Michael Higgins.
Welcome to Alberta Primetime. Ahead tonight, our politics panel on fuel tax relief remaining off the radar. But first, pipelines and opposition.
If we don't do this, let's just be clear, the United States will eat our lunch. We have to start thinking big and building big again. That's what Canada used to be, and I believe that's what Canada can be again.
Alberta government responds to the announcement of a formal coalition of Indigenous, rural and farming communities opposing the proposed Pathways Alliance pipeline to ship carbon from the oil sands to an underground formation in the Cold Lake area, a project that is also part of the Alberta-Ottawa MOU supporting a new oil pipeline to the West Coast. And joining us now, Chief Kelsey Jacko of the Cold Lake First Nation. Chief Jacko, good to meet you, sir. Welcome to Alberta Primetime.
Yeah, good day, and thanks for having me.
All right, you've added your voice to this coalition of opposition. What is it about this proposed carbon capture pipeline that is most concerning for the residents of the Cold Lake First Nation?
Well, for decades, resource development has occurred in our homelands without enough say from our nations, resulting in significant community impacts on our lands, water, and treaty rights. Treaty was intended to share the land to the depth of the plow. We've been denied a fair share of prosperity generated from development within our territory, despite never giving up our rights to the minerals. Past decision-making over how the lands were used has been at the sole discretion of the federal and provincial government. For example, First Nations were never allowed lawyers when policies were passed decades ago, and so we could not fight them. Today, we have no ability to practice commercial fishing to sustain our livelihood on the Alberta side of our traditional waters. Premier Smith keeps pulling more and more responsibility to her and away from the people. Before Bill 7 was passed last fall, the law required the government of Alberta to go out and talk to the people and do a lot of engagement with high bars to meet before they can move water between watersheds. Then they had to make it to the legislative and debate about it in public with the opposition. But they changed that last fall. Now Premier Smith can move water with a stroke of pen. She doesn't seem to understand that land stewardship is a shared responsibility that requires us all. Governments must recognize that as right holders, we are centered to the protection of our lands, waters, air, and everything creature who rely on it, biodiversity. We have a responsibility to the stewards of the lands in a Dene way. As a leader, it's hard to honor the Dene way in balance with types of development that have been taking place. We have been asking for more information on the carbon sequestration for 3 years now. We haven't gotten crickets. Alberta and Canada government signed a memorandum of understanding to construct a multi-dollar toxic waste site in our backyard with no consultation or benefit to our community. We have been respectfully asking for a conversation about this project for years and got nowhere. We have asked for AER reform and heard crickets. So much has been done to the lands. It's hard. The cumulative impacts on all these projects are adding up, and they need to be coordinated. The consultation process needs to be reformed. We have so many unanswered questions, and I know all Albertans generally do too on this and other proposed projects. And yeah.
And this, you're not alone, it would appear that you're not alone in this regard, Chief. This coalition brings together quite the mix of communities, quite the mix of perspectives. How united are you as a group?
Well, we have the same concerns. What are we creating for generations to come? Is this proven science? It's going to cost lots of billions of dollars to store this carbon, and is it going to store all the carbon they say it's going to be? In the end, the taxpayers are going to be on the hook. Now Alberta has announced it's going to be fast-tracking major projects approval within 120 days, but we've been asking questions for 3 years. I don't know if we're ever going to get the answers, and I'm scared certain acts are going to be disrespected. The Species at Risk Act,
You brought up the point a moment ago about consultation. The Alberta government says the Aboriginal Consultation Office and the AER, in conjunction with the proponent for Pathways, they've all been working with 18 Indigenous communities. How's that land with you?
It doesn't land very good with me. You know, we're the only one nation in Alberta that has a deal with Canada and Saskatchewan about about the air weapons range. You know, how do we build up the trust before? You know, our livelihood was taken away. We were removed from our lands. Now they have this proposed project, but, you know, my people are still suffering out there, and the environment is suffering. Everybody thinks about the economics, but no, the environment suffered.
On that point of economics, with a price tag of more than $16 billion, this is a big dollar project. And when governments, as we heard in the clip from the Environment Minister a moment ago, they're all saying it's time to think big. Where do you weigh in on that?
Well, it's time to think big, but we're left out of the conversation. We asked for a seat at the table, and it never happened. You know, people are making decisions without us. You know, what's this free, prior, informed consent about? Because we've been asking questions for years now, and none of these answers have been provided to us, and they just keep deflecting on one another. Like, let's have everybody in the same room. That's all we're asking.
How much of an opportunity is there to benefit, maybe economically, from this project? Has anything been presented in that regard?
Well, they're talking about a Pathways Plus and they're tying a pipeline to this, but, you know, there's tied to water. But, you know, when it's all diluted down, you know, it's not going to really benefit the nations. You know, there's 200 nations in BC, there's 48 nations here in Alberta, and I'm not talking about the Métis. So you're talking about equity, like, you know, when it's all watered down, the nations are not going to really see anything. You know, we didn't cede or surrender anything. We agreed to share. You know, a lot of decisions were made when we weren't even allowed to challenge them. We weren't even allowed lawyers till 1961. And lots has been done already, and, you know, that's what I inherited.
Maybe one more quick one for you, sir. If for your community, what might it take for the governments and the regulators and the companies involved to answer to your concerns, such that maybe ultimately you could see supporting this through? Does it boil down to consultation and doing assessment?
Well, our communities hold all the risk and none of the economic benefits of this project. It's completely unacceptable. Our nation is not a garbage dump for American-owned companies. That has to be addressed. Revenue sharing. We did not cede or surrender anything, and now they're talking about equity in projects. You know, and they're still having conversations trying to push this through. But it's unfortunately, we might have to go to court to get our answers.
Okay. All right, sir. We'll have to leave it there. Very much appreciate your time this evening, Chief Jacko. Thank you.
Oh, yes, it's very concerning, and still have unanswered questions, and hopefully my questions will be answered one day. And Masi Cho, and thank you for the time.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. That's Chief Kelsey Jacko of the Cold Lake First Nation. From opposition to a proposed CO2 pipeline in our province to no go on a break on fuel taxes, and the federal government's response to 4 provinces now pushing for judicial appointments reform. Time for our politics panel, and joining us this evening, Tyler Gannon, former mayor of Wetaskiwin, former president as well of Alberta Municipalities, and John Santos is a political analyst. Good evening to you both. And let's begin with Indigenous and rural leaders banding together in our province to oppose the Pathways carbon capture project. We heard from Cold Lake First Nation Chief Kelsey Jacko off the top on his involvement in the No CO2 Pipelines Alberta group. Tyler, what's to be made of a coalition bringing together Indigenous communities, rural landowners, and farmers? What does that unique mix speak to?
I think it's fantastic. It speaks to the fact that people are feeling like they can join together when they are united in a vision or when they're opposing something, to be able to go cross-border throughout your community and throughout your region and be able to come together and find a common goal. And make your voices heard. I think it's fantastic to see people coming together.
John, how do you see these voices of opposition landing at a time when the Alberta and the federal governments continue to drive forward on seeing through the MOU that paves the way to a new West Coast pipeline, an MOU that specifically ties in this contentious Pathways carbon capture project?
So based on the chief's remarks, I'm not sure they've narrowed specifically on what their biggest concerns are, what their deal breakers are, and which things they might be able to move given sufficient action from either the federal or provincial governments. And so they're pointing out a lot of very legitimate concerns. This is a relatively new technology. There is a history of leaks to CO2 pipelines that have caused injury in other jurisdictions. And so there are definitely issues that need to be addressed. But on the other hand, with the way that not just the federal and provincial governments are moving, but the world is moving. A lot of places are seeing carbon sequestration technology as a way to decarbonize, reduce greenhouse gases without necessarily reducing emissions. And so a lot of people are banking hope on that because it's perceived to be a lower cost way to deal with climate change than reducing emissions. So I think they're facing an uphill fight, but they certainly have some very legitimate concerns that they brought forward.
And Tyler, do you see a point where municipalities get involved in this conversation and contention over the Pathways project?
In the conversation, for sure. I'm not sure about the contention. Again, John had pointed out that there wasn't a clear ask or a clear opposition to what was happening. And that's probably the biggest problem with consultation. My level or my expectation of consultation is different than somebody else. As a former mayor or as Alberta Community's president, I often felt that we weren't heard by the province. But at the same time, does that say that there wasn't the opportunity for consultation? It doesn't change the procedure of consultation just because what I've said or what the province has said as a whole doesn't change the direction of the provincial government. Doesn't mean there wasn't consultation and that we weren't heard. So I think there's a fine line between having the conversation or being heard and actually fundamentally making changes.
All right, next up for us, while oil prices have come down a bit in recent days with the ebb and flow of the Iran war, pulling up to the pumps remains a painful exercise. The Alberta government isn't considering, though, any fuel tax breaks. Here's what the Premier had to say during her weekend radio show.
I don't know how quickly this conflict is going to end, but if it turns out that we end up not only with the higher royalty revenues, but also with gas tax revenues, we'll see if we can look at some programs that will help those who are really facing the pinch from an affordability point of view.
Sustained high oil prices have not yet reached the threshold needed to trigger the province's fuel tax relief program, and the Premier says under those guidelines, the best the province can do would amount to a reduction of 13 cents a litre. John, surprised there isn't some form of commitment from the government to act on the fuel tax relief program if it is that the oil price parameters are met. That, you know, the Premier's instead talking about maybe moving forward on affordability programs for those in real need.
The Premier is entirely right. There's a process in place with clear benchmarks that need to be reached in order to trigger a rebate on the fuel tax, right? And that's to make sure that it's not being applied willy-nilly to score political points. The other thing is, like, I don't see the government offering any kind of leniency on that process because they themselves are facing a budget crunch. So why would they willingly give up revenue that they don't have to, right, when they can sort of stick to the process and let that play out as needed. And so, no, the Premier's entirely right. Like, there's a process that exists for a reason. And if Albertans are as, in love with the free market as they ostensibly are, then they can heed the market signal and make changes to their behavior appropriately.
Tyler, what do you see the government weighing and whether or not it triggers the fuel tax relief program, especially in the wake of a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit projection?
John nailed it. I don't think this should be a knee-jerk reaction to an increase to any type of commodity. We are facing a well over $9 billion deficit and another deficit And I think that if we're going to start to cut taxes or look at maybe more responsible ways to lower the costs for Albertans, I think that's done through strategic planning and thoughtful budgets, not through budget cuts or tax cuts that happen just because of what's happening geopolitically.
John, does there come a point, though, where Albertans push back and there becomes an expectation?
Maybe, but I mean, by the same token, like, you don't need to be a math person to know that even if the government knocked off all 13 cents of the fuel tax, the magnitude of the increase that we've seen as a result of the Iran conflict is much higher than that, right? So this is entirely driven by geopolitical forces. And even if the government were to sacrifice all 13 cents of that, gas prices are still markedly higher than what they were before the Iran conflict. And so, no, I think the government's going to hold a line in the sand here. And as Tyler rightfully pointed out, right, budgetary decisions should be made thoughtfully, not willy-nilly on a whim. Especially when, this is a market signal. The market will react appropriately.
All right. Time for us to take a bit of a break. But when we come back, could a showdown be building over judicial appointments? More from our politics panel in a moment. Welcome back. Alberta now has 3 provincial partners on board with the call for more involvement in the appointing of judges, but it remains a no-go from the federal justice minister.
We welcome provincial government's participation in that process and proactively reach out after we receive recommendations through the judicial advisory committees to test with our provincial counterparts whether they've got information about the reputation of the people we're considering. I found that to be very informative. We've had a lot of positive feedback from a range of different, from every province, frankly, when it comes to the appointments that we have made.
Earlier this year, Alberta's premier threatened to withhold funding for new judicial appointments unless the federal government grants the province more input on the selection process. On Tuesday, she posted a letter signed by herself and the premiers of Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Quebec supporting the push, saying we need to act toward lasting reforms that will serve to reinforce confidence of all Canadians in our judiciary. Alberta's October 19th referendum also slated to include a question on provincial government selecting justices. Tyler, despite the federal minister's response, might there be a degree of room here to negotiate some form of compromise between the federal and provincial governments? Mark Carney's approach to working with provincial counterparts certainly differs from that of his predecessor.
All right, and I think Minister Fraser was pretty clear that they're open to those conversations. And so does that give the opportunity for those 4 premiers, as well as the rest of the premiers across the country, the opportunity to have more input on those justice appointments? And I think if it's not working, then we need to change it. But if you're not actually using the tools that are available to you to begin with, then I think you need to go back and figure out how to do that appropriately, and then get your point across that show examples of where these justices aren't doing their work in Alberta. Not just saying that you want more oversight without a clear reason as to why.
Well, John, under the current process, there is a mechanism allowing for provincial consultation on these appointments. How do you weigh that against what these premiers are calling for? Is there that significant a difference?
This speaks to the point that Tyler just made about using the tools that currently exist more effectively. There's a 7-member committee. I'm just looking at just the Justice Department's little explainer on this, right? So the committee that appoints these judges include 1 nominee of the Provincial or Territorial Law Society, 1 nominee of the Provincial Bar Association, 1 judge nominated by the Chief Justice of the province, 1 nominee of the Provincial Attorney General, 3 nominees of the government representing the general public, and 1 ex officio non-voting member. And so I think there's sort of plenty of room, even just within the committee, of who gets appointed to this committee to oversee it, the appointments process, to review applications to become senior judges, that can accommodate some of the premier's demands. I mean, unfortunately, if we sort of parse their language, I think what they're looking for is absolute control or an absolute veto over anyone that might come up through the ranks. And I don't think substituting a provincial veto over this non-existent federal complete control misperception that people have over this process is any kind of improvement. In fact, I think it's a step backwards. So like Tyler said, there's a process. Let's change that process and enhance it to meet some of the concerns from the premiers.
Tyler, if that veto wasn't there, though, how far do you think this particular group of 4 premiers might be willing to push their point? Might this result in a showdown of sorts?
I would obviously speculation, but I agree, or I would think that there would be a showdown. One of the troubles that I have with that, though, is that the Premier has proposed a referendum for October, and one of the questions on there deals with how justices are appointed. So if we're going to be listening to Albertans, as Premier Smith has said she puts trust in, what happens if that referendum comes back and it doesn't say that we want oversight into that justice appointment or more oversight into that justice appointment? I think we're putting the cart before the horse here and dealing with something that the Premier has put out to Albertans that we haven't had a clear direction on through that referendum.
John, how likely are these premiers to have public opinion on their side? At what point might the voice of, say, Albertans play into the conversation, referendum or not?
That's a tricky thing to answer because, I mean, like anyone can have an opinion on things, but there's a question of like how accurate is the information that goes into forming that opinion, right? And I think there's a lot of public, both ignorance and misinformation in terms of how this process works. And so I think the federal government needs to do a better job of articulating and explaining what exactly this process is, because I think if more people knew about that, the concerns about lack of provincial input might be attenuated a little bit. And so I think public opinion could be one way or another, but I see the potential for it to shift as more people become informed about how exactly this process works.
Indeed. Okay, gentlemen, we're out of time. Have to leave it there. Great to see you both. Thank you kindly for this.
Thanks.
Thanks, Michael.
How much do you like cupcakes?
10 out of 10.
It's also a 10 out of 10 decorating sweet treats with this even sweeter girl.
Yours looks amazing.
Born in 2014, Chloe takes her time getting each detail just right.
I like art and I color, decorating cupcakes and I decorating cake.
This creative girl enjoys calm, quiet moments, but she also knows how to have fun.
Maybe for the rest I could just eat it like this.
Chloe knows herself well and loves to share about her favorite things.
My favorite food is noodles. My favorite color is pink and purple. My favorite book is Dogman.
This precious girl deserves a forever family to share life's everyday moments with. Cheers. For more information, go online to alberta.ca/Wednesdays-child.
Proudly supported by CTV.
Now, here are a few responses to a recent story posted by CTV News, and it's about Premier Smith saying fuel tax relief is not coming anytime soon, since she doesn't know how long the conflict in the Middle East will keep driving up oil prices, and it would only make a dent in the cost of fuel. Joe says 13 cents is still 13 cents. Cypher thinks we have oil. It's time we build the refineries and become energy independent. It's a national security risk to allow another country to define our quality of life. Mike writes, I don't know what conservatives are crying about. Thought they loved oil prices being high. More money for the oil companies. Egg says, don't know how quickly the conflict will end. She's acting like everything is going to be back to normal tomorrow. David thinks we need a finishing plant in Alberta to make our own gas. Have your say. Email us anytime at comments@albertaprimetime.com. Coming up tomorrow, BC efforts to draw health professionals north of the border are bearing fruit. So, could the same be achieved in our province? We'll hear from the Alberta Medical Association on Thursday. Until then, have a great evening, everyone, from all of us at Alberta Primetime. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time.